I wasn't supposed to hear it. It was 11:47 at night. I know the exact time because I had just checked my phone while tiptoeing down the hallway to get a glass of water for my daughter, Rosie. 3 years old, and she still woke up twice a night asking for water like clockwork. I had learned to move silently through that house, past the marble floors, past the framed awards on the wall, past the closed doors of a life that wasn't mine. But then I heard it, a voice, soft, almost broken. I stopped breathing. The voice belonged to Serafina Cole, my boss, one of the most composed, untouchable women I had ever worked for. The kind of woman who could end a boardroom argument with a single glance and sign $1 million contract without flinching. And she was in her study, alone, whispering those words to no one, or maybe, to the idea of someone. I stood there in that dark hallway, Rosie's small cup in my hand, my heart doing something I hadn't given it permission to do. And I walked away, but I never forgot those words. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing. I made Rosie her oatmeal, cut her strawberries into tiny pieces the way she liked, and reminded myself of the rules I had set for myself the day I took this job. Rule number 1. Serafina Cole is your employer. Nothing more. Rule number 2, Rosie comes first. Always. Rule number 3, do not complicate the one stable thing you have built for your daughter. I had 3 rules. That was it. They had kept me grounded for 8 months. But rules have a way of feeling very thin in the early morning light. I was organizing her schedule at the kitchen island when Serafina walked in. She was already dressed. Charcoal blazer, hair pulled back, coffee in hand, the picture of control. Nothing about her suggested that last night had happened. Nothing suggested she had been whispering broken questions into an empty room. She glanced at Rosie, who was happily smashing strawberries with a spoon, and the corner of her mouth moved, just barely, like she caught herself almost smiling and stopped it before it could become something real. "Good morning," she said to me, professional, measured. "Morning," I replied, same tone, same distance. She picked up the printed schedule I had left on the counter and studied it. Then she set it down and looked at me over the rim of her coffee cup. "Clear your calendar for Thursday and Friday," she said. "We're going to Harlow Ridge. The Alderton merger needs to be finalized in person, and I need you there." I nodded. "I'll make arrangements for Rosie." There was a pause, a beat too long. "Bring her," Serafina said quietly, almost carefully, like the words had been considered before they were spoken. I looked up. She was already turning away, walking back toward her study, heels clicking against the marble, with that familiar, deliberate precision. I stood there for a moment. Holding the edge of the counter, Rosie looked up at me with strawberry on her chin and said, "Gotta go?" I looked down at her, at those wide, trusting eyes that had no idea how complicated the world above her head was becoming. "Yeah, baby," I said softly. "We're going." But somewhere beneath those words, beneath the routine and the rules and the careful distance I had built, something had already started to shift, and I was not ready for it. Harlow Ridge was 3 hours from the city. Serafina drove herself in the car ahead. I followed in the company SUV with Rosie strapped into her car seat, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit and watching the trees blur past the window with wide, sleepy eyes. By the time we reached the cabin, she was already half asleep against the side of her seat. The cabin was not what I expected. It was large, yes. Serafina did not do anything small, but it was warm. Wooden beams, stone fireplace, windows that looked out over a valley turning gold in the late afternoon light. It felt less like a business retreat and more like somewhere a person came to exhale. I got Rosie settled on the small sofa with her rabbit and a blanket, while Serafina set up her files at the dining table. For an hour we worked in our separate lanes. She reviewed documents. I prepared dinner from the groceries we had brought. Simple pasta, the only thing I could make confidently that Rosie would also eat without negotiation. That was when it started. "You're stirring that like it personally offended you," Serafina said from behind her laptop. I looked down at the pot. I had been stirring aggressively. I hadn't noticed. "Force of habit," I said. "Is that a cooking technique or a personality trait?" I turned slightly. She was watching me over the top of her screen with an expression I had never seen on her before. Light. Almost playful. "Both," I said. "Keeps things from sticking." She tilted her head. "Is that your life philosophy?" "It's my pasta philosophy." I try not to apply the same logic to everything. She laughed quietly, but it was real, unguarded in a way that made the whole room feel different. You make terrible jokes, she said, returning to her screen. You laughed, I pointed out. I was being polite. You don't know how to be polite. You know how to be strategic. The typing stopped. I kept my eyes on the pasta, suddenly aware that I had said something true and something bold in the same breath. The silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable but charged, the kind of silence that holds more than words could carry. Dinner smells good, she said finally, quietly. Thank you, I said, and we both pretended that was all it was. If this story is already pulling at something in your chest, you are not alone. Hit that like button and stay with me, because what happens after dinner changes everything. Rosie fell asleep at 7:30. I carried her to the small bedroom at the end of the hall, tucked her rabbit under her arm, and pulled the blanket up to her chin the way she liked, tight on the sides, loose at the top. She stirred once, murmured something soft and unintelligible, and then her breathing settled into that slow, even rhythm that only children can find so completely. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary. There was something about watching her sleep that always did something to my chest. Something that was equal parts gratitude and grief. Grateful she was here, grieving that her mother wasn't. I pulled the door halfway closed and turned around. Serafina was standing in the hallway. She had changed out of her blazer. She was wearing a simple gray sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she was holding 2 mugs of tea like she had been standing there long enough to decide it was a good idea. She went down easy, I said quietly. I heard her stop talking, Serafina said. She extended one of the mugs toward me. I made chamomile. I didn't know what you liked. Chamomile is fine, I said. Thank you. We moved to the back porch without discussing it. The valley below was dark now, but the sky above it was extraordinary. The kind of sky you forget exists when you live inside city lights. Stars in numbers that felt almost unreasonable. We stood at the railing and said nothing for a while. Then she spoke. How long have you been doing this alone? I wrapped both hands around the mug. Rosie just turned 3. So 3 years, that's a long time to carry something that heavy. You stop noticing the weight after a while, I said. Or maybe you just get stronger. I'm not sure which one it is. She was quiet for a moment, then, I have been running my company for 6 years, and I still go home some nights and sit in that study, and wonder if any of it means anything without someone too. She stopped herself. The sentence hung in the cold night air, unfinished. I looked at her. She was looking at the stars. Her jaw was set, but her eyes were soft in a way that the boardroom never got to see. And I understood, without either of us saying another word, that we were both exhausted in exactly the same way. The morning of the second day arrived quietly. Mist sat low over the valley, and the cabin held the kind of stillness that cities never allow. I was up before anyone else, old habit from 3 years of early mornings with Rosie, standing at the kitchen counter with coffee, watching the fog move slowly through the trees below. I heard her before I saw her, not footsteps, just the sound of a drawer opening carefully, trying not to wake anyone. Then Serafina appeared in the kitchen doorway in that same gray sweater, hair still loose, eyes carrying the soft, unfocused look of someone not yet fully assembled for the day. She saw me and stopped. You're already up, she said. Always, I said. Coffee's ready. She moved to the counter without her usual precision, poured herself a cup, and leaned against the opposite counter. We stood on either side of the kitchen in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't ask anything of you. Rosie still sleeping? She asked. For at least another hour, I said. She sleeps longer when the air is cold. Serafina nodded slowly, looking down at her cup. Then she said something I wasn't expecting. I used to want children. I didn't respond immediately. I gave the words the space they deserved. Used to? I said finally. She lifted one shoulder in a half shrug that wasn't as casual as she intended. At some point, the company became the thing I poured everything into. It's easier to love something that doesn't leave. The last 3 words landed quietly but heavily between us. I set my cup down. Everything leaves eventually, I said. Companies fold. Markets change. People, I paused. People leave too. But they also come back. And sometimes they give you a 3-year-old who destroys your sofa cushions and makes you feel like the world is still worth showing up for. She looked at me then. Really looked, the way people do when they are not just hearing your words but measuring the weight behind them. "She's remarkable," Serafina said softly. "Rosie, she has your eyes. She has her mother's stubbornness," I said. A small smile crossed her face. "Then she'll be unstoppable." We stayed in that quiet for another moment, and then she straightened, set her cup down, and said, "I need to review the Alderton files before the call this afternoon. Can you pull the supplementary documents from the second folder?" Just like that. The professional mask back in place, but something was different now. Because I had seen what was underneath it and I couldn't unsee it. The afternoon call went smoothly. Rosie sat on the rug nearby, quietly assembling and disassembling a small set of wooden blocks with the focused intensity only toddlers can sustain. Serafina handled the call with her usual precision, sharp, clear, completely in command. But twice during that call she glanced at Rosie. Not a quick glance, a long one. The kind that lingers because something about the sight is filling a space you didn't realize was empty. I noticed. I said nothing. After the call ended, Rosie stood up, walked directly to Serafina's chair with the confidence that only 3-year-olds possess, and held up a single wooden block. Serafina looked at her. Rosie said, "You hold it." There was a pause. Then Serafina reached out and took the block from her small hand, with a carefulness that looked almost reverent. Rosie nodded, satisfied, and went back to her rug. I was looking at my laptop screen, but I saw the entire thing in my peripheral vision. I saw the way Serafina held that small block in both hands for a long moment before setting it gently on the table beside her. I saw the way she pressed her lips together, like she was holding something in. I looked down at my screen and felt something in my chest crack open just slightly. That evening, I was walking past her study to bring Rosie her water. The same routine, the same hallway when I heard it again, not whispering this time, silence. And then the sound of a drawer being opened. Paper unfolding. I should have kept walking. I didn't. I need you to stay with me right now. Because what I found in that drawer is the reason everything almost fell apart. If you're invested in this story, hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. This is the moment everything changes. I don't know what made me stop. Maybe it was the quality of that silence, the way it felt held rather than empty. Or maybe it was the memory of the first night, standing in the same hallway, hearing words that had lived in me ever since. Whatever the reason, I stood outside her study door, Rosie's water cup in my hand, and I looked through the gap where the door had not fully closed. Serafina was at her desk. In front of her was a document, several pages, clipped together, with a letterhead I recognized immediately. Alderton Group. The same merger we had spent 2 days preparing for. But she wasn't reading the merger documents. She was reading something else. A separate letter, handwritten, on personal stationery. And her hand, that steady, unshakable hand that signed contracts without hesitation, was trembling. I stepped back from the door. My mind moved quickly, pulling threads together that I hadn't thought to connect before. The timing of this trip, the specific instruction to bring Rosie, the way her father, Edmund Cole, had called twice during our drive up, and she had let both calls go to voicemail. The clause I had noticed in the Alderton supplementary file that afternoon, a clause I'd assumed was standard legal language, but now, standing in this hallway, felt like something else entirely. I went back to Rosie's room, put her to bed, sat on the edge of the small chair beside her until her breathing slowed. Then I went to my bag and found the copy of the supplementary file I had printed that morning. I read the clause again. It wasn't standard language. It was a condition. The Alderton merger, the deal Serafina had been working toward for over a year, contained a personal conduct clause inserted by Edmund Cole himself, her father and the company's founding shareholder. The clause stated that to retain sole executive authority over the finalized merger, the CEO must demonstrate, and I am using the exact words I read that night, evidence of a stable personal foundation, including a committed partnership. In plain language, she needed to appear to be in a relationship or the board would divide her authority. I sat with that paper in my hands for a long time. Every carefully chosen moment from the past 2 days rearranged itself in my mind. The invitation to bring Rosie, the chamomile tea, the porch, the stars, the conversations that had felt so unguarded and real. Had any of it been real? Or had I been positioned, I folded the paper, set it down, looked at the wall. The part that hurt the most was not the clause. It was not her father's manipulation or the corporate machinery behind it. The part that hurt the most was that somewhere between that first night in the hallway and this moment, I had stopped being careful. I had let something in. I had allowed myself, for the first time in 3 years, to imagine that the weight I carried might one day be shared. And now I was sitting alone in a cabin bedroom, feeling like the world's most predictable fool. I didn't sleep. By 4 in the morning, I had made a quiet decision. I would finish the professional obligations of this trip. I would maintain my composure for Rosie's sake, and when we returned to the city, I would hand in my resignation with 2 weeks' notice and a professional letter that gave nothing away. I was not angry. I told myself I was not angry. But my hands were not entirely steady when I packed Rosie's bag in the early hours of the morning. At 6, I heard movement in the hallway. Then a knock at my door, soft, uncertain. Nothing like her usual knock. I opened it. Serafina stood there. No blazer, no composure. Her eyes were red at the edges, and she was holding the handwritten letter at her side like it weighed something significant. She looked at me and said quietly, "I think you read the file." It wasn't a question. I said nothing. Her voice dropped lower. "It isn't what you think it is." "Then tell me what it is," I said. And even I could hear how carefully I was holding my voice together. "Don't you dare close this tab. Because what she says next, I promise you, is not what either of us expected. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story about love that costs something real." She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the letter in her hand, then back at me, and something in her expression shifted. Not the careful, calculated shift I had come to associate with her professional adjustments, but something rawer, something that looked remarkably like shame. "Can we sit down?" she asked. "Serafina, please." That word from her, it landed differently than any word she had spoken to me before. Serafina Cole did not say please the way other people said please. She said it like it cost her something. I stepped back from the doorway. We sat at the small table near the window. Outside, the valley was just beginning to catch the first gray light of early morning. The mist was still there, lower now, sitting in the spaces between the trees like it was waiting for something to be resolved before it moved on. She set the letter on the table between us. "This is from my father," she said. "He wrote it 8 months ago, the same week I hired you." I looked at the letter but didn't touch it. "The clause in the Alderton file, that was his doing," she continued. "He inserted it without my knowledge 3 months ago when he still had temporary board access during the restructure. I only discovered it 6 weeks ago." "6 weeks," I said. "Yes. And the trip?" She exhaled slowly. "The trip was genuine. The merger finalization is real. Everything about the professional purpose of this weekend was exactly what I told you it was." "But you knew about the clause when you invited me," I said. "You knew, and I brought you here because the work required it," she said firmly. Then her voice softened. "And because," she stopped, started again. "Because I wanted to. Because for the first time in longer than I can remember, being around someone felt like something other than performance." The cabin was very quiet. Outside, a single bird had started somewhere in the trees, tentative, like it wasn't sure the morning had fully committed yet. "The letter," I said. "What does it say?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she pushed it gently across the table toward me. I read it. Edmund Cole's handwriting was precise and angular. The handwriting of a man who had spent a lifetime making things legible and authoritative. The letter was addressed to Serafina personally. It was not cruel, which somehow made it worse. It was the letter of a father who believed he was helping his daughter, written in the language of business because it was the only language he fully trusted. The relevant paragraph read, "You have built something extraordinary, Sarah. But a company without an anchor will drift. I have watched you choose this work over every human connection for 6 years, and I have watched it hollow you out in ways you do not yet see. The clause is not punishment. It is a question I did not know how to ask you directly. When are you going to let someone in?" I set the letter down. I read the last line again. "When are you going to let someone in?" And then, with a slowness that moved through me like cold water, I understood. The words I had heard through the study door that first night. The whispered question that had started all of this. Were you ever going to ask me? She hadn't been talking to herself. She had been reading her father's letter out loud. Alone in her study at midnight, reading the question her father had buried inside a legal clause, and turning it over in her own voice to see how it felt. Were you ever going to ask me? Not a scheme, not a strategy, not a performance. A woman, alone, holding a question she didn't know how to answer. I looked up at her. She was watching me with the careful stillness of someone who has said everything they can say and is now entirely at the mercy of another person's response. Her hands were flat on the table, not trembling, but still, the kind of still that takes effort. You weren't talking about me, I said quietly. That night. You were reading the letter. Yes, she said, but then I stopped. Something moved across her face, a crack in the stillness. But then, she said softly, I looked up from that letter and I thought about you, in this house, down the hall. And I realized that the answer to my father's question, the real answer, was already somewhere in that hallway. Had been for months. She paused, and I didn't know what to do with that. The bird outside had been joined by others now. The gray light through the window was warming, slowly, at its own unhurried pace. I sat with everything she had said and let it settle properly, not rushing toward a response, not protecting myself with quick words, just sitting with the truth of it. 3 years. 3 years of rules I had made to keep Rosie's world stable and predictable. 3 years of carrying everything alone, because asking for help felt like weakness, and wanting something for myself felt like a luxury a single father couldn't afford. 3 years of walking past closed doors and telling myself the distance was wisdom. I've been afraid, I said. The words came out quieter than I intended. Since Rosie's mother left, I made myself believe that the safest thing I could do for Rosie was to keep our world very small, very controlled. That if I didn't want anything beyond what we had, nothing could take it from us. Serafina said nothing. She was listening the way very few people know how to listen, completely, without preparing her response. But small worlds have a way of feeling like walls after a while, I said. And somewhere in the last 2 days, I stopped, looked at my hands. Somewhere in all of this, I stopped feeling like I was inside walls, and that terrified me, because it meant I had already let something in before I had decided to. A long silence, then she said, very quietly, were you ever going to ask me? Not her father's question now, her own. I looked at her across that small table in the early morning light, with the mist in the valley and the birds finding their voices outside, and my daughter sleeping peacefully down the hall, and I felt something in my chest release. Slowly, like a breath held for 3 years, finally let go. I didn't think I was allowed to, I said honestly. You are, she said, simply, without performance or strategy or careful calculation. Just 2 words that carried everything. I did not resign, not that week, not ever. What changed was slower and quieter than the dramatic resolutions you see in films. It did not happen in a single moment of declaration. It happened in increments. In the drive back to the city, where Serafina turned the radio down and asked Rosie what her rabbit's name was, and Rosie said Gerald, with complete seriousness. And Serafina laughed the kind of laugh that has no agenda behind it. It happened in the weeks that followed, when she started coming into the kitchen in the mornings, not just for coffee but to sit at the island while I made Rosie's breakfast. And the 3 of us existed in the same space, with an ease that felt earned rather than assumed. It happened the evening she came home from a difficult board meeting, sat down on the living room floor without explanation, and Rosie, who had no understanding of board meetings or corporate clauses or complicated fathers, climbed directly into her lap with Gerald the rabbit and stayed there. And Serafina sat very still with her arms around my daughter and her eyes closed. And I stood in the kitchen doorway and understood that some things heal people in ways that no professional achievement ever could. It happened the night she finally called her father back. I didn't hear the conversation. I was giving Rosie a bath and doing my best impression of a submarine captain, which Rosie found unreasonably entertaining. But when I came out later, Serafina was sitting on the back porch with her phone face down on the railing and an expression that was tired but lighter, like something long carried had been set down. How did it go? I asked. He cried, she said, like she still couldn't entirely believe it. My father, who has never cried in any memory I have of him, cried. I sat down beside her. He said he just wanted me to be happy, she said quietly. That's all the clause ever was. A clumsy, controlling, completely misguided attempt to say, I see you're lonely and I don't know how to help you. Fathers, I said. She looked at me. Fathers, she agreed, and then she leaned her head against my shoulder. Not dramatically. Not with any particular announcement. Just the simple weight of someone choosing to rest against something they have decided to trust. I didn't move. I sat there on that porch in the city night, with her head on my shoulder, and the distant sound of traffic below, and Rosie's quiet breathing coming through the baby monitor on the table. And I thought about the night I had stood in a dark hallway holding a small cup of water and heard a woman ask a question into an empty room. I thought about how far a person can travel without moving an inch. And I thought about Rosie, my whole and entire reason for every careful rule I had ever made, and how she had walked across a cabin floor with a wooden block and handed it to a woman who needed something to hold. Children know things. They know them before we do, and they act on them without fear, and maybe that is the only wisdom that actually matters. Sometime later, on a quiet Sunday, with Gerald the rabbit presiding over the kitchen table and Rosie eating oatmeal with reckless enthusiasm, Serafina looked at me over her coffee cup with that expression I had learned to recognize. The one that was light and real and entirely unguarded. You never actually ask me, she said. I'm asking now, I said. She smiled, slowly, completely, in a way that reached everything. About time, she said, and outside the kitchen window, the morning was unreasonably bright. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that love doesn't always arrive loudly, that sometimes it stands quietly in a hallway waiting for you to stop being afraid, please share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Leave a comment telling me which moment hit you the hardest. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because every story I tell is made for people who still believe that the quiet ones are worth the wait.